Good afternoon, everyone. If I can get your attention, please. If you can get your lunch and we can get resituated into the room so we can start our lunch plenary. So I hope everyone's been enjoying the panel sessions. I think we've had some really good conversations in both working families and in aging, so I hope you were able to learn a lot and get educated on those important topics. We're looking forward to this lunch plenary where we will address key civil rights issues faced by minority communities, and we'll highlight ways that the API community can reject being used as a wedge in the broader fight towards racial equity. So some of the things that I want to reiterate from this morning on housekeeping, that this is a closed press and off-the-record conversation. For those of you who are interested in just amplifying some of the things that we're talking about today, please use the hashtag ALNSummit18, and we will move on with getting this situated today. So to all of those who've joined the live stream, welcome, or welcome back if you joined us earlier in the morning. And in case you can't watch the whole session, this plenary will be recorded to watch at a later time. So we are thrilled to have KPAC Chair Congresswoman Judy Chu with us. She serves as the first Chinese American woman elected to Congress in history, and she represents the 27th District of California. Under her leadership, KPAC has grown to a record size with 22 executive members across both chambers of Congress. She currently serves on the powerful House Ways and Means Committee and the House Small Business Committee. She's a tireless advocate and champion for the API community, and we are so excited to have her join us this afternoon. Let's welcome Congresswoman Chu.
Well, thank you, Madeline. As chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, I am so thrilled to be here at the kickoff of the inaugural APAICS Leadership Network Policy Summit. For years, I have been advocating for a summit like this because I feel that Asian Pacific Islanders and people of color deserve to come together and dialogue so that we can realize the power and potential of our communities. And so Madeline Milke decided to take this up as her inaugural step as president of APAICS. Now you are all here today from around the country. You've been joined also by members of KPAC, and in fact, I'm so thrilled to be joined here today by our wonderful Congressmember Bobby Scott, who is the first voting member of Filipino descent in Congress. Yes, that's so fantastic. And so, yes, it is a thrill to be here with you so that we can truly talk about the issues that affect us. Now, as I said, the power and potential of the Asian Pacific Islander community is so great, but the power and potential of the Tri-Caucus is even greater, of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, and our Congressional Asian Pacific Caucus. On the Asian front, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are now the fastest growing racial population in the country. We're one of the fastest growing voting blocs, and by 2040, our electorate is expected to double. In Congress, we've seen our growing numbers through political representation. We've grown from 13 AAPI members of Congress to 18 AAPI members of Congress in the 2016 election alone. And that is our highest number in history. And because we very much welcome non-AAPI members to join because they have large Asian Pacific populations that they want to represent, we actually now have members of Congress from all over, and now our numbers are 63, which is another historic high. Yes. But we're especially excited about our strong coalition with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and Congressional Black Caucus. That is our Tri-Caucus. And you know what? in our Tri-Caucus, our numbers have grown so much that we make up over half of the Democratic members of the House of Representatives. Yes. That is significant because when we work together, we have the power to be a strong voice on issues that matter most to our communities. And our issues are very urgent. First, we need to address our healthcare disparities. For Asian Pacific Islanders, just take one disease, hepatitis B. Even though we are 6% of the population, we are 50% of the cases of hepatitis B. How can that be? We know that health disparities is a real thing. And that's why in each Congress, the Tri-Caucus takes turns to introduce the Health Equity and Accountability Act. We take turns heading this act, and this year is KPAC's turn. So we introduce the bill, and we work closely with community-based organizations and our Tri-Caucus colleagues to put a comprehensive legislative solution to promote health equity. This legislation builds on the advancements of the Affordable Care Act and works to eliminate racial and ethnic health disparities impacting our communities. It would also provide culturally and linguistically appropriate health care that would help our communities and promote a more diverse healthcare workforce so that we can better serve our communities. And we need to address the attacks on immigration in this country. And for Asian Pacific Islanders, we especially have to defend ourselves on the attacks against legal immigration. We've witnessed Donald Trump's attempts to spread xenophobia and pit communities against each other. He has continuously portrayed immigrants as criminals, murderers, and terrorists. And so we know we have to fight back. But what is especially harmful for Asian Pacific Islanders is the attack on legal immigration. He wants to dismantle the process of legal immigration, which has been in place since 1965, which reversed the very discriminatory National Origins Act, which mainly favored Nordic Europeans, or severely limited Jews and Southern Europeans, and banned Asians entirely. And if President Trump had his way, we would not ever be able to petition for siblings, for adult children, and what is most shocking is you could never petition for your parents ever again. Now, if you look around any Asian community, most of the people sitting in the room have actually come here through the process of family immigration. So basically, our population will be devastated if those cuts and this dismantling went through. But what we have to do is work in a coalition. We have to work in a coalition to protect our nation's undocumented youth, our dreamers. We have to work to protect the diversity visas, because unless we do it all together, basically our immigrant communities are pitted against each other. So we cannot take the bait of just isolating one community against each other. We cannot support a bill that would trade one family's pain for another. And so we must stick together and make sure that this is a country for all immigrants. Immigrants have built this country, and we must make sure that that continues to be a reality. Woo! And we need to address our right to vote. Our right to vote is so precious. We Asian Pacific Islanders know that, especially because we were deprived of it during the first half of this last century. Chinese Americans in particular were disenfranchised by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, one of the most discriminatory acts in American history. It is the only actually name an ethnic group for exclusion, but one of the most pernicious things was the fact that it prohibited the Chinese from becoming naturalized citizens, so they could not vote. And thus, Chinese Americans were disenfranchised for pretty much the whole 1900s. But what has made things worse in this country is the Shelby County versus Holder decision, which hurt the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that Voting Rights Act certainly was important for Asian Pacific Islanders, in which guaranteed that there were such things as translated ballots for communities such as ours, which has such a large population of monolingual speakers. But it had devastating effects all across this country, as it required voter IDs and other kinds of requirements that stop people from being able to exercise their votes at the polls. So that's why we have to work together as a tri-caucus to make sure that everybody can fully participate in the political process. So we have joined together to continue to push for a modern Voting Rights Act that will ensure that everybody can cast their vote in this democracy. Well, on these issues and more, the Tri-Caucus will continue to work together to advocate for legislation and policies that will make for a stronger America. But we cannot do it if we are divided and focused on our own self-interest. So we must continue to build stronger coalitions and empower our collective communities to reach our shared goals. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thank you, Congresswoman Chu. Next, we are very honored to welcome Congressman Bobby Scott, who is chair of CAPAIC's Civil Rights Task Force and an active member of the Congressional Black Caucus. He represents the 3rd District of Virginia. Congressman Scott is the first African-American elected to Congress from the state of Virginia since Reconstruction, and is also the first voting member of Congress with Filipino ancestry. Congressman Scott serves as ranking member on the Education and Workforce Committee, where he leads the fight for access to quality education for all children. Prior to Congress, Congressman Scott served in the Virginia House of Delegates and the Senate of Virginia. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Madeline, for your very kind introduction, and thank you for taking over for Floyd. He did a great job for many years, and I look forward to your good work. Give Judy Chu another round of applause. She's a great leader. CAPAIC has grown and been much more active under her leadership, and so thank you, Judy, for all that you do. Now, since its founding in 1994, APAICS has served as an integral role in educating Congress about the issues of importance to the Asian Pacific American community. It has encouraged the communities to speak out about their needs, challenges, and contributions to their communities, and engage them in the public policy debates that are shaping our country. Our country is built on diversity, and only by serving all communities, especially those who have been recently or routinely disenfranchised, can we meet our full potential. Now, as it's been mentioned, I'm African American and active member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and having Filipino ancestry on my maternal grandfather's side, I can tell you that both communities have come a very long way, but we've got a long way to go, and we can't turn around and go backwards. The current administration and the majority of Congress are constantly chipping away at the gains we've made, and Congress, many efforts have been designed to try to undermine the success we've made. But there is, as Judy mentioned, strength in numbers. When you add CAPAIC, the CBC, and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, we are just about close to a majority of the Democratic caucus. And hopefully that caucus will be in the majority in the 116th Congress next year. As Judy mentioned, when we work together with those kinds of numbers, there's a lot that we can do. If we try to work separately, there's little that we can do. So it serves us well to work together to lift all of our communities. And working together is not a hard sell. If you look at the voting records, most of the members of the CBC, CAPAIC, and CHC vote pretty much together anyway. Issues like health care, She mentioned voting rights, education, immigration. We're pretty much on the same side. The current fight to protect affirmative action is one example of how we need to work together. Although we thought affirmative action had been settled back as far back as the Bakke decision and the Michigan cases, and most recently in 2016 in the second Fisher case, upholding affirmative action programs, so long as they're not quotas, so long as it's one of many factors that they can be considered. The court has underscored that a rigorous academic environment is enhanced by diversity, but unfortunately, with a new wave of challenges and more conservative court to hear them, we just don't know what's going to happen to questions of diversity. The most recent challenge with Harvard's policy alleging that so-called less qualified persons are getting in to the disadvantage of Asian Americans is a dangerous and cynical attempt to turn communities of colors against each other. Now, it's cynical because the legal reasoning used in this case will be turned against us in future cases if it's successful. There is a question anytime you're using ethnicity as a factor, it is inherently suspect. And according to the law, it is subjected to what's called strict scrutiny. And you can do it, but only if you can survive strict scrutiny. And there's two-part test. One, you have to have a compelling state interest to do what you're doing. And second, what you're doing is narrowly tailored to address that issue. Now, if they get away with this case, they may well find that diversity is not a compelling state interest. And if they get away with that, you can find situations where blacks, Asians, Hispanics are not getting any contracts. And you want to have some affirmative action to increase the contracts going to minority contractors. That would be illegal if they eliminate diversity as a compelling state interest, because you couldn't use race at all in terms of that. And so if they get away with this, in this case, they will have a powerful weapon to defeat affirmative action in all cases. That's why a majority of the civil rights groups, including AAPI groups, have come out in support of affirmative action and against this litigation. Last Thursday, unfortunately, the administration filed a statement of interest in the case, taking a position against affirmative action and continuing their pattern of hostility to affirmative action. This summer, the Trump administration rescinded guidance on policies to divert diversity and equity in education, and this is obviously going to have a chilling effect, but this is something we can take care of that in 2020. But if the courts decide, that's going to be something that's going to be hard to work with. But affirmative action is just a small part of achieving equal opportunity in education. One way you can achieve equal opportunity is to make sure that everybody can afford to go to college. In 1965, when President Johnson signed the Higher Education Act, he said that this means that any student in any state can apply to any college and university and not be turned away because the family is poor. And since then, everybody has been able to go to college, but in recent years, it's become more difficult. States are not putting in the kind of money they used to put into public education. States used to spend, for the cost of a state college, states used to put up about 2/3 of the money. A Pell Grant would knock out the final third, and anybody could go to college with a little part-time job for incidentals and work their way through college, no debt. Now states aren't putting up 2/3, they're putting up, in many cases, much less than 1/3. And so the cost of college before you get to inflation is doubled. And so people are having to take out loans, mortgage-sized loans. Many students have more of a student loan than their parents have on a mortgage. And so people are calculating they can't afford to go to college. And if you're talking about something that's going to sabotage diversity, restricting a 4-year on-campus college education experience to only those who can write $50,000 a year checks will ruin diversity in education and ruin the life options for many Americans. We're also looking at health care, making sure people can have health care. Those with pre-existing conditions have benefited from the Affordable Care Act because they get insurance at the same rate everybody else. Now they want to change that and go back to the good old days, I guess good old days in their minds, where the insurance company could charge you if you had a pre-existing condition anything they wanted, or deny you insurance altogether. And they have a lawsuit that's being heard, in fact, today in Texas to sabotage the Affordable Care Act. But there's a lot of work that we have to do. And Madeline, thank you for all the work that you do to make sure that the community is engaged. We need to make sure that all of this engagement is focused on voting. There's a story of two little boys on the way to school. School bell rang. One of them took off running, looked back. His friend was kneeling. They said, "What you doing?" He said, "I'm praying I won't be late." He said, "Yeah, well, I'm praying too, but while I'm praying, I'm running." We need to make sure that as we do all the seminars and learn the issues, that we focus then on November 6th to make sure that people not only are well informed, but that they also vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Scott. I'm now thrilled to welcome Congressman Jimmy Gomez. He is an executive member of CAPAC and an active member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. He represents California's 34th District, and he currently serves on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee and the House Natural Resources Committee. Let's also give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Let's give Madeline a round of applause because I know she's been doing a good job. And I know we're here to kind of discuss how the tri-caucuses as well as across communities we can work together to tackle some of our biggest issues. You know, everything from healthcare, the environment, to mass incarceration, to the educating of our kids, all of that, those issues. But working together has always been the best way to accomplish these goals. You know, I worked for Hilda Solis when she was a member of Congress back in 03, 04. And those were different times. You know, the caucuses weren't as big as they are now. I would say the influence wasn't as great as it is now. But times are changing. And I got to serve in the California legislature, which now is a model of leadership when it comes to a variety of issues. But it's leadership that's led from the direction of minority communities. You know, it is Kevin DeLeon who's passing SB 100 to get 100% renewable energy by 2024. Or Rob Bonta, the first Filipino-American elected to the California State Assembly, who helped pass bail reform for the first time in California's history. You know, these are folks that are leading the battle. But there was a time in California, I know everybody thinks, oh, that's just California. But there was a time in California's history where the minority communities were put into a corner, right? And they said, work on minority issues. But that time had come and gone. You know, the leadership of the California legislature has shifted. You know, Judy Chu was the chair of the California Assembly Appropriations Committee. I would say the second most powerful position in the California legislature. And I became chair of that committee years later. We've had consecutive speakers when it comes to African American, Latino, women, LGBT, you name it. We've been kind of breaking the barriers. But I believe that Congress is on the verge of breaking a lot of those barriers as well. especially within the Democratic caucus. But we can only make sure that that power that we gain from our numbers is used in a positive way is if we actually work together. Not by just simply talking about it, but doing the hard work of advocacy, of research, of mobilization, because that is what it's about. Everybody always asks me, how do you get groups to work together that have never worked together before? Well, you start by, having a conversation. You start by deciding, this issue is important to this group and that group. Judy Chu mentioned the issue of immigration. Judy Chu led, and John Lewis was in attendance as well, and I got to attend. Thank you, Judy, for inviting me to do a rally and march to shut down the Customs and Border Patrol. And it was a broad coalition of individuals, members of Congress, and community organizations. And we marched to the Customs and Border Patrol, and we tried to shut it down, but they wouldn't arrest us. Then we went to the White House, and we tried to shut down the park in front of the White House, but they wouldn't arrest us. So we shut down 14th Street for a few hours, and they still wouldn't arrest us. But what I saw is that we had John Lewis, and we had Judy Chu, and a variety of individuals from different caucuses working together, because family separation is not just a Latino issue, right? It's an American issue. It's a moral issue. And that we're working together to push back against administration that is attacking all of us, on voting rights, on the 2020 census, on health care, on a woman's right to choose. Go on and on and on. We are all under attack. But I have no doubt that if we all work together and focus on the work, right, and how each individual issue will impact each community, it's going to make a huge difference. One of the things I mentioned is family separation. Not family separation, but the ending of family reunification as a major issue for the Latino community, not just the Asian community, right? Diversity lottery. We should care about diversity lottery as much as the African American community cares about it. So we have to focus on those issues. And also look at the fact that we all represent, and we're representing more and more diverse communities. My district, I'm proud, is one of the most diverse communities in the entire country. I have the largest Korean population of any congressional district. I have the largest, Filipino population of any district in the country. Salvadorians, Guatemalans, Mexicans, hipsters, you name it, I represent it. And my job is to represent every community to the best of my ability, to try to communicate in their language as the best I can, to try to see their perspective on every single issue, because that is my job. And I know that that's the job of the Tri-Caucus, to fight for one another. And you're going to hear from a panel that's going to go over some of these issues, but they've been on the front lines of these battles for decades. And I like to give them just kind of a round of applause. Let's give them a round of applause, because I know elected officials, we like to think that we're where the sun rises and sets, but elected officials come and go, but the communities and the organizations remain. And that's where I want to kind of tell them, without them, we wouldn't be where we're at. So with that, thank you so much for having me, and good luck on your panel. Congratulations. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are we doing? My name is Greg Orton. I'm the National Director of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, which is a coalition of all the Asian American organizations here in D.C. And before we get started, let's give one more round of applause to all the members of Congress who joined us and for all of their hard work. Now, for me, my professional hat as in Kappa, couldn't be more proud of APAICS and the work that they're doing. But my personal hat as a former APAICS fellow who a long time ago worked in Congress for Congressman Al Green as senior staff, I'm thrilled, because if any of you guys have been to the sister and brother organizations of APAICS, the CBCF and CHCI, you guys see what's possible. And this is the first one for APAICS. And so stay with us. Let's see where we're at after 5 years and 10 years and beyond, because we're growing. So, as we heard from the members of Congress, the Tri-Caucus is a growing force in Congress and a force to be reckoned with. And as Congressman Gomez pointed out, to effectuate real change, we have to do the work in the suites and in the streets. And it's an honor to be joined by these panelists because these are individuals who in their own individual capacity and their organizations are doing a little bit of both. And so I'd like to introduce very briefly Clarissa Martinez from Unidos US, Ian Record from the National Congress of American Indians, Emily Chatterjee from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Ed Tepborn from the Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum, and Maria Datrouche from the National Urban League. And I will turn it over to them and have them introduce themselves a little bit more, talk about their work and their organizations, but also frame it in a way that, in terms of how their organizations approach building multiracial coalitions to tackle the issues of our time. So thank you very much, and Clarissa.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be able to engage in conversation with you all. I have a feeling that a lot of what we're going to talk about today is stuff that is known to you because you got to do that kind of stuff every day to create transformational policy change for the communities that you work with. And communities, whether we define that as the overall American community, a particular segment of communities geographically, which is multiracial and multi-ethnic in many parts of this country, or very focused, of communities within that American community by race or ethnicity. I think that how you manage to do that work is the same as how we go about doing our work. And basically, I think that, for Unidos US, formerly National Council of La Raza, who we're turning 50 years old. Well, we did. I'm doing a little bit of age backtracking, but yes, we turned 50 this year. And if you can think back of 50 years ago and what the level of awareness this nation had about America's Latino community, it was almost non-existent. So partly for that at the very beginning was, there wasn't research on Latinos. The census wasn't really providing information about Latinos. So for us, one of the things we had to do, being the largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization, with one of our big charges or areas of work being achieving transformational policy change for that community, is actually educating members of Congress and making them aware about who Latinos are and that they're part of the nation. And so that involved doing a lot of primary research at the very beginning, and helping support Latino organizations in many parts of the country who were scratching and pulling as best they could to create a footprint to respond to the needs of this community. And so look at 50 years later, I think many of the same things that we had to take into account and guided our work then are true now. One of the things that sets us apart, not just among Latino organizations, but organizations in general, in which you may consider for the way you do your work, is that we look at how to create transformational policy change and making sure that there's the opportunity and the ability of people to actually access that opportunity. We look at it from a policy perspective, which for a long time tended to be focused on federal policy, but more and more state policy. So through policy, through programs, and through people, right? So we have folks who, outside of the legislative lobbying arena, they work on developing programs for community-based organizations in order to learn from them. And then people, we have an umbrella, several of the networks in the Asian American community, an umbrella of community-based organizations throughout the country with whom we work. So 50 years ago, and still true today, to achieve the transformational policy change that is going to allow Latinos and other working Americans to really make opportunity real, gotta work together, right? I wish that we had the power to say it's my way or the highway. Even if we did, I don't think it would be what would be the best for the country. But the reality is that there are too many things. So you got to work with other folks to do that. And as you all know, because I'm sure that you all also have to do that to advance your goals, whether it's locally, regionally, or nationally, it ain't easy, right? Coalition work, it's not for the faint of heart. And it requires a lot of work, building relationships and having the trust. But I think that it is seminal to something that has become clearer and clearer in recent times, and that is that the politics of divide and conquer are not anything new. They are ancient. They are very intense right now. But more than anything, the ability to work together to lift up what still a majority of Americans believe, which is that diversity is a national asset and strength, is something that I think behooves us all to work on, to elevate and not allow it to erode, generally speaking, but also from a very direct self-interest, because the divide and conquer and the fear of the other is being used to actually advance all kinds of policies that are incredibly damaging to the present and to the future progress and contributions of all of our communities. And so that's been one of the areas that has been really exciting to work on with many of the folks that are here at the table right now and many others in the room and beyond, looking at balancing the responding to the urgency of now and trying to carve out the time, which is always challenging, of building for the future to defend that national asset that diversity is.
Well, good afternoon. My name, again, is Ian Record. I serve as Director of the Partnership for Tribal Governance with the National Congress of American Indians. And I'll explain a little bit more about the organization and how we approach the incredibly important task, as Clarissa pointed out, of coalition building. But I wanted to lead off with a story. And for those of you who don't know, 4 of the organizations represented here at the table are part of a coalition of 9 that are called the Racial Equity Anchors of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And we've been working together for years, but about 3 years ago now, I believe, Kellogg issued a charge to the 9 organizations to say, it's good that you guys come together and share your stories and figure out where you have commonalities, but we want your collaboration to be more structured. And part of that process has involved what we've come to call cross-racial capacity building, which is a really fancy term for basically learning about one another. And we had an occasion a couple of years ago when Ed's organization hosted one of our quarterly meetings in San Francisco to hear from a gentleman by the name of Don Tamaki, who some of you may know his name. A longtime attorney, has worked for decades to right the horrific wrong of the Korematsu case, which, as you know, dealt with Japanese internment during World War II. And in his presentation, he was sharing how the detail of how that policy came to be, the internment policy, the rhetoric that was used to justify that horrific policy, and how it was played out, and the impacts that it had on Japanese Americans. And as I was sitting there listening to this, it really hit home that this policy is nothing new. This policy has been perpetrated on other communities of color for decades. Because as he was laying out how this policy played out for Japanese Americans, it was exactly the same as it was perpetrated on Native Americans, with the reservation policies of the 1870s on up through the current day. And it's ironic that some of those Japanese internment camps were actually situated on Indian reservations. If you go to the Gila River Indian community in Arizona, you know, that's where one of the Japanese internment camps was based. And I think what the story shares and what it really drives home is the fact that the policies that are designed to oppress any one particular community of color, as you see it from your perspective, you can bet that that policy is systemically designed to oppress all communities of color. And so I think it's incumbent upon us, particularly in this environment, to remain hyper-vigilant against those policies that are designed to oppress one community, because no doubt it will oppress all communities of color in some form or fashion. And so that's why the coalition that we're all engaged in has been so important, because we get to see how some of these systemic policies and really learn the detail of how some of these systemic policies manifest themselves in our respective communities. You know, a good example of this is the school to prison pipeline issue, right? We saw anecdotally, you know, from the Native perspective, how this policy was impacting Native youth. But it wasn't until we really came together with organizations representing other communities of color and sharing data and really getting the true sense of the immense gravity of this, and how this policy was being used to deepen racial inequality, deepen economic inequality, push people into the prison system for profit by those in power. And so I think that's one point to lead off with. Just briefly on NCAI, for those of you who are not aware, we're celebrating our 75th anniversary this year. We're the oldest, largest, and most representative organization representing tribal governments and Native people. And among the many activities that we engage in is nonpartisan education. Nonpartisan education. We work to educate all members of Congress, no matter what side of the aisle they're on, and we do it on an ongoing basis. And so, and I know it's easy to maybe chalk up, you know, a newcomer to Congress is saying, oh, they're not going to be interested in my issue because this is the platform they ran on, or this is the party that they come from. But you can't take that for granted. I'll give you a good example real quick in wrapping up. One of our greatest champions in Congress now is a Republican member of Congress who's from a district that has no tribal governments, tribal nations in it. And it's because we engage in a sustained education effort, and we appeal to his morality, we appeal to his position as a representative of the United States government, that he has a trust and treaty obligation to support tribal sovereignty and to support the rights of Native people. And so, you know, you got to cast a wide net, and you've got to be sustained, and you've got to be willing to work across community to make those sorts of good things happen.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Chatterjee. I'm with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. I'm very pleased to be here today, and thanks so much for having us all join you today. So the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights was founded in 1950 by giants of the civil rights movement who came together. It was originally folks from labor, from the civil rights community, and also from the faith community, who knew in their bones that we could not really make advances if we were not working in coalition. The JACL was one of the founding members of the Leadership Conference, and today, I think everyone up on this dais, every organization that's represented, is a member of the Leadership Conference. So we, through the years, have played a fundamental role in passage of all of the major civil rights acts that have gone through Congress, from the Civil Rights Act of 1957, 1964, Voting Rights Act, the ADA, so from then till now. So we fundamentally believe in the power and importance of working coalition with every community. The Leadership Conference today is a coalition of more than 200 national organizations working to build an America as good as its ideals. We are in really tough times, as everyone here knows. These are not normal times, right? And working in coalition is even more important than ever. We are sitting here today while there are hearings going on in the Senate Judiciary Committee, for a seat on the Supreme Court that may tilt the balance of the court for generations to come on issues that are important to every single person and every single community represented in this room. Everything from voting rights to health care to reproductive rights to access to fair housing, healthcare. I mean, the list goes on. Every single issue is potentially at stake. And frankly, one of the things that everyone is talking about is I'm at stake, right? This is not about just issues, it's about people. So that is one of the main things that we're working on. But if we're working on to build an America as good as its ideals, and we have such a broad coalition, there are a lot of different issues that we work on. Foundationally, we are working on a number of issues that are important to our democracy, because the foundations of our democracy, we believe, are fundamentally imperiled at this moment. So that includes access to voting rights. That includes access to a fair and accurate census, ensuring that people are accurately, fairly counted, and ensuring that there are fair courts. In addition to that, we're also trying to advance ideals and policies in education, justice reform, immigration, hate crimes, anti-hate crimes, obviously, big data, and economic security, which is a vast, vast area, right? So I want to touch on something that my colleague here talked about, which is internment of Japanese Americans, right, and how this has been historically true. I want to note that one of the things that has really been a silver lining of the past few years is how people have really been coming together and working across community and standing up for one another. One of the decisions that, coming back to the court, that happened at the end of June was the Muslim ban decision, right, that the Supreme Court handed down, showing us once again how important the court is. And I will say that one of the communities that really came forward, fighting the first groups to really come forward to say, look, this is a problem, this Muslim ban, is the Japanese American community, who said, look, we know this history, this is our history, we cannot have this repeated. So that is one example of how important coalition is, and coming together and seeing how we are aligned. So I know we're going to talk more about some other ways, some other successes and other things that we're going to be, are on the horizon that we want to ensure that everyone knows about. So I'll leave it at that point for right now.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you to APAICS for the opportunity to be part of this panel, and to my fellow panelists, thank you for the opportunity to be in continued coalition and community with you. I'm Ed Teflorn. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. And as many of you already know, the Health Forum is one of the oldest and largest organizations focused on Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander health justice. For the past 32 years, we have sought to influence policy, to mobilize communities, and to strengthen programs and organizations to improve the health of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. And I wanted to share with you a little bit of the origin story of the Health Forum. And as you listen to the story, you may hear ribbons of similarities to your own organizations and to your own personal journeys. So back in 1985, then U.S. Secretary of Health Margaret Heckler issued a groundbreaking report on Black and minority health. It was a multiple volume report of about 10 different binders, and the report was truly significant in that it lifted up for the first time the opportunity to advance awareness about minority health in our nation. But unfortunately, what the report concluded was, in aggregate, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were healthier than other communities. Now, at the time, the Assistant U.S. Surgeon General was a doctor by the name of Samuel Lin. And Dr. Lin, as he traveled the country for his official duties, also took the opportunity to share his vision of what it would look like to have a national organization that was focused on advocating for equitable and responsive health equity for our communities. Now, back then, this was again in the mid-'80s, there was no roster of Asian American, Native, or Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities. There was not a LinkedIn or a Facebook, a MySpace or a Friendster. What he did have, though, was what he did have was the yellow pages, no pun intended. And so what Dr. Lin did was he went through the yellow pages and he looked at the names of Asian-sounding doctors, and he reached out to those doctors via landline, not cell phone, to share with him his vision of this national organization. And luckily, there was a group of not only doctors, but also community-based organizations who were interested in creating this national voice to raise attention to health equity for our communities. And in the 3 decades since, the Health Forum has grown into a multi-million-dollar nonprofit organization with nearly 30 staff. For those of you who are based in DC, you may be more familiar with our policy work, and indeed, over the years, we've walked up and down the halls of DC's to advocate for health access, health coverage, better data, and more resources for our communities. We've worked to help establish the first executive order that created the White House Initiative on Asian Pacific Islanders. In partnership with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, as well as the Association of Asian Pacific Community Health Organizations, we co-founded and co-led Action for Health Justice, which was a national coalition of organizations that collectively enrolled 1 million people in healthcare coverage. But the Health Forum also has a long history of non-policy work and doing similar work to what Clarissa has described and what Ian has described and what Maria will describe in terms of the Urban League's work, in terms of also building community and building infrastructure. And so since 1993, we've been funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to conduct HIV prevention capacity building across all racial ethnic communities. Over the years, we've also distributed over $10 million to community-based organizations on the ground to support their local and statewide health equity efforts. And this winter, I'm excited that we'll be launching the third cohort of our Health Rising Leadership Institute, a 9-month leadership development program that trains community leaders to become more effective leaders and more impactful storytellers. And it's through that opportunity for us to really be better at telling our own personal journeys, telling our organizational journeys, telling the story of the data of our communities, and in doing so, doing it in a way that doesn't necessarily detract from the stories and journeys of other communities, that I think that we have the opportunity to really build a coalition with one another.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Call and response is universal. Okay, so my name is Maria Daltrouche, and I'm at the National Urban League, and I'm really feeling privileged and blessed to be here on this panel with these wonderful people. Thank you, Madeline, and thank you, everyone, for the invitation. And to my fellow panelists, thanks for putting up with me once again. We work together a lot because coalition requires that, apparently, yeah. So the National Urban League is not 30 years old, not 50, not 75. We are 108 years old. Yeah. Which is applaudable and also like, why are we still here? Which is why we're still here, right? We need to like work. You can go pretty fast alone, if fast is 108 years, but you can go farther together. So
you look really good for 108.
You know, it's all about water and yoga. Yeah, right now the Urban League has 90 affiliates across the country. We serve approximately 2 million people a year, that's annually. We have a DC-based operation that does our policy work, and on the ground through our 90 affiliates, we operate programs and direct services in the following areas: education, health, workforce development, and community development, and housing. I mean, do any of those 4 categories touch on your life at all? Mm-hmm. Oh, then the Urban League is happy to serve you. Because while our mission, which dates back to our founding 108 years ago, is specifically to enable African Americans to secure economic self-reliance, parity, power, and civil rights. As with most things that are 100 years old, every now and then you need to revision, re-articulate that. So we remain committed to our historic civil rights organization status, and that we've been around doing this work long before the civil rights movement was a thing. Mm-hmm. But also that our communities are changing demographically, actual landscape, and that we are open to serve all people who work through our doors. Our leaders look like the people from the community they serve. And we do that because it's necessary and because we believe that our organization was founded to make this country, again, live up to its ideals. And so when we tell the story of the National Urban League's founding, we often think about individuals from the South who were looking for opportunities that did not exist for them economically where they were from. So they were moving north and then eventually west. Dig a little deeper into the history of that time outside of our own preferred narrative. And what they're really doing is escaping racial terror of the South. They're escaping lynchings, they're being run out of their homes, they're being burned out of their homes, they're being threatened, their businesses are being destroyed, And so that is what leads to a mass departure. Not just there's something better up ahead, but right here is really horrific. And I think that while there could be varying levels of horror and terror, many of us feel in our own lives and in our own family and social networks tinges of terror. And I would just, in the framing of this coalition building work, encourage us to resist the tempting and almost sometimes default game of oppression Olympics. No one is legitimately benefiting from that. There's no winner's circle in that Olympics game. What does work is when we all work together on the issues that cross-cut and that uplift everyone else's experience. And so at the National Urban League, for years we have put out the State of Black America report, and in the past few years we have included in that report an index of equality in the country that blacks face compared to their white counterparts. In recent years, we've included Hispanics in that indice. We would love to include more groups. I think Ed and I share a deep frustration with disaggregated data so that people get a fair, accurate picture of what their communities look like. I also want to raise something personally, because when you carry on your shoulders 108 years of history, it gets heavy. And then that history is presented to the world every day in the leadership of Mark Morial, who also sends his regards. He's a broad-shouldered, strong guy. It's a lot to carry, so I'm just going to shift that weight and really talk from a personal space about why coalition is so important. I was born here in this country to parents who immigrated here from another country in a community that was very insular, and so it wasn't until high school that I realized there were black people here who were not from the country we were from. And so everyone I met, I assumed was from where I was from, because where my family was from, because our family looked much like this room. There were people of all shades who spoke various levels of the dialect we share on that small island. When I go back to visit my grandparents, we shop at Mr. Chin's shop, and Jamaican Chinese food is the best Chinese food. You can argue with me, but I will still hold fast to that belief, for it is true to me. And so I think that this issue that we'll dig into more about wedging, it doesn't just happen in one way. It's an easy default because it's an old game. It's an old trap. And the reason old traps work is because they're the best traps. You know, at the end of the day, if you want to catch a mouse in your house, you go back to the old traps. No new thing on the market's going to convince you it's going to work a little better than just a little bit of cheese on whatever new convention you bought. So this old trap of wedging, it happens within our communities. So within the black community, African immigrants, Caribbean immigrants are used as a buffer, as a tool, as a device to divide and conquer. And then we see it in other communities as well. And that's just something we all individually and collectively need to resist against and fight against and call out within our own organized communities, and then use that information to check ourselves and hold one another accountable to working more authentically together. Also, I would say that I think the great enemy is white structural racism. It just doesn't work for any of us, and it also does not work for white folks. It's not useful to a strong economy, to safe borders. It's just not helpful. We are stronger, actually, in diversity, and so the attack on that is very it's felt by the National Urban League and by me personally. I personally also believe that an ingredient in white structural racism is anti-black racism. Mm-hmm. And I believe anti-black racism exists in all communities. I believe, though I am not a part of the Asian American Pacific Islander community, that it exists in your own communities. And I believe it's something that at some level we all need to struggle with, grapple with, find solutions for, and then come together with those solutions and move forward. Blackness does not necessarily, in that case, to me, look like the color of skin. There are many ways that we blackify people and blackify groups of people and then hold them down, depress and suppress them because of some aspiration for the opposite of that, which is whiteness. All of it is contrived, and it was all designed, and it's bad design. And so when something is poorly designed and we just keep deciding to function in it, we really need to ask ourselves, who is actually benefiting from this poor design and my participation in that system? And I think if we're honest, more of us are not benefiting. And so more of us can spend our time working in coalition to build systems that work better for us.
Now, I know asking all of these panelists to talk about the difficulties of coalition building might be a little bit triggering. I mean, honestly, myself included. But we're going to go for it. We want to get real. So whether within the Kellogg Racial Equity Anchor Table or the Leadership Conference, if you guys could talk a little bit about your observations or experiences with the challenges of coalition building, but also, let's be positive, talk about some of the successes and what that's looked like. I'm going to single out Ian and Ed for your respective communities that you represent to talk a little bit about making sure that your communities are visible even within the spaces where we are working with allies. So with that, I'll turn it back to Clarissa.
Ian and Ed? Or?
Okay, so.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that rather than go about what's difficult, because like I said, you guys are dealing with this every single day. If you're working on policy or program delivery or the ability to create opportunity, I think that the most important thing is just to acknowledge that one is not always going to agree with coalition partners, right? And so if you think about how you navigate, whether it is with family or a spouse or friends, the fact that you don't agree on everything, but you stay friends or you stay family or whatever it is, it's very similar. I think that for us at Unidos, one of the things is to be a straight shooter, right? So if we don't agree with somebody or we cannot support a particular position, or even if we are going to have to oppose, particularly if we're going to have to oppose a particular position, is to be straight up about it so that people don't be taken by surprise, and that we try to navigate what is the most effective way if we disagree on something so we don't undermine each other. And the other thing is, you know, Wade Henderson, who used to be at the helm of the Leadership Conference, used to say this a lot, and it always stuck with me, that you gotta be a friend to get a friend, right? So sometimes folks are gonna ask for your support on things that you may not work on, and you can't say yes to everything, because frankly, we all have to deal with that. Our communities are affected, like any human being, by everything under the sun. If we worked or tried to respond or go to the meetings we get invited to with everything under the sun, we would actually also do nothing under the sun. So you got to say no to things, right? But there might be some opportunities where you can show up and be supportive, even if it's not a priority for your organization, because people will hopefully in time do the same for that which you care really about. And so a couple of more tangible examples, I would say, so in the realm of divide and conquer, and I'm going to use one example is immigration, since I do a lot of work on that. I do a lot of work on civic engagement. But, in the issue of immigration, in addition to try to turn the native-born against the foreign-born, the reality is that at its core, the issue of immigration is not really about immigration, but it's a proxy to try to advance the fear of the other and using that to otherize our communities regardless of what our status is, whether we're citizens, undocumented, or some of the most vetted immigrants in the country like DACA or TPS recipients. And so sometimes the way that plays out in the battle is that folks try to say, okay, family immigration is what the APAICS community cares about, and Latinos care about the legalization. So we're going to try to set those up against each other. And so particularly during the last real battle on immigration in the 2013 time, that was playing out. And so we at Unidos were able to participate and testify in defense of the importance of family immigration in Congress, so that it would be clear that we cared about that and we thought it was a fundamental bedrock of our immigration system. In the current environment where there's a big battle on public charge, which is a way to try to change the rules on legal immigration, to try to really block the door to people who look a certain way from coming in legally, right? There's also work that's going on, among others, between the Health Forum and Unidos to really try to engage all of our networks, the organizations that are part of the Health Forum, the nearly 300 affiliates that are part of the Unidos network, to weigh in on that issue, and just how wrong it is to try to change the rules just in a way to exclude people who are trying to come here legally. And last but not least, we also know divide and conquer is used, as Maria mentioned, within our communities, within our very own communities, as well as between communities. And one traditional thing has been for folks to talk about how immigrants, and frankly trying to paint all Latinos as immigrants, even though 8 out of 10 Latinos in the United States are United States citizens, as a threat for the African American community. And so working together to really create a public presence of joining hands while doing some education with our own community, so hopefully people become more and more inoculated to those easy attacks. But also, you know, knowing that that issue gets used in a variety of inaccurate ways, with the, more recently, with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was about our education system for all kids, not immigrant kids, the civil rights community worked very closely together, and we worked very closely with the National Urban League to prevent that, any kind of opening for that to happen, to try to undermine the education of one group of kids by telling that community that addressing the needs of these kids was a zero-sum game that meant losses for them. And not only that, but after being successful at the federal level in doing that, now working together at the state and local level to make sure that that spirit of the law is respected in advance in the way that states are implementing ESSA now that it's getting devolved to state and local decision making. So those are a couple of just tangible examples, but obviously any one of those is ripe and full of discussions where there's disagreements and people have to agree to disagree, and also what is going to be the overall push that people are going to make, and the space where disagreements can be hashed out, because that weakness empowers the very forces we're trying to overcome.
Hard act to follow. She hit on a lot of the points I wanted to share. I wanted to, in the time I have remaining, talk to you a little bit about the mechanics of coalition building. You know, NCAI for the past 75 years, we've been functioning like a Congress. We are a coalition organization, essentially, of several hundred tribal governments as well as thousands of Native people who come together twice a year and come into an agreement about what their priorities are and what advocacy they're going to engage in here in Washington, D.C. and at various state capitals across the country. And very early on, our founders realized the importance of consensus, right? And you hear that term a lot, consensus. It's a lot easier to talk about and a lot harder to actually achieve. And, you know, Maria mentioned Oppression Olympics, and I had that on my top notes because that's something I wanted to stick a pin in this conversation, because we've seen that come up even in our Kellogg Anchors Coalition, that devolving into Oppression Olympics. And I think in many ways it's sort of this subconscious crutch to say I'm more comfortable in my own silo, working in my own community, within my own community of color, and I'm not willing to put myself out there and really embrace this notion, this fact that we are stronger together, to borrow a cliche from a recent failed political campaign. But we are, in fact, stronger together, and we see the proof in the pudding of so many of the policy advancements that we've made over the past 50-plus years. I mean, you look at the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization of 2013. For the very first time, tribal governments gained the right to prosecute non-Native offenders of domestic violence crimes on tribal lands. That would not have happened without the partnerships of our other organizations representing other communities of color. I think, though, coalition building is easier said than done. And what we've tried to do, particularly over the last 2.5, 3 years, is, as Kellogg has laid out this charge for us, to to actually engage in formal collaborative projects with one another around civic engagement, around the census and message narrative shift, if you will, is to figure out how do you institutionalize that? How do you make that a process and not so much an event? Because coalition building is not an event, it's a process. And it requires really steadfast, solemn commitment by the lead people that your organizations choose to put in charge of that partnership building effort. And so very early on, we decided on the need to develop a set of foundational values and operating principles. How are we going to work together to build together, to grow that common sense of purpose, to grow that common story of us, and to really try to institutionalize the process by which we build respect for one another, trust of one another, knowledge of each community's journey to now, to here, to this place of sharing a table, and then how do we create that level playing field where there's mutual understanding, mutual accountability, and equitable contribution. And these are values and principles that we revisit every single time we get together, because you can't take for granted that everyone in the room or everyone in the coalition is on the same page. You have to continually reorient each other to the common story of us. And each coalition is going to take their own approach to this, but it's an incredibly important part of the process that you must engage in.
Clarissa is right when she noted that the Leadership Conference famously speaks about the fact, I think it's an Emerson quote, that if you want to have a friend, you have to be a friend, and that means showing up for communities that are maybe not your own. And it also means passing the mic, right? Not just keeping it for yourself and making sure that just your voice is being heard. And fundamentally, coalition building is about building relationships. This is long, hard work, and there are going to be disagreements, as was already noted. But that is what it takes to build a coalition and to maintain a coalition and to grow a coalition, right? One part of passing the mic, and I think really in terms of being inclusive and building power and building community, you guys are all familiar with the term manel? No? So you've all seen it. It's a panel that is only male. It's a manel. There are blogs that document manels. So we do not believe in manels. We also do not believe in in panels for, I mean, and a panel is just a representation, right, of like what I'm talking about, where it's only one type of person or one community that's represented. We think very intentionally about who we're making sure is at the table, and often we have broader panels as a result because there are a lot of different views that need to be heard that may not be teased out by different groups. I mean, and so that goes to racial diversity, that's gender diversity, that's LGBT diversity, that's disability, which cuts across all of these issues, right? Union membership, there's so many different parts to identity, and they're all intersectional. So when we approach any particular issue, trying to think about it with that lens that is very, multidimensional, I think, right? Because we are all multidimensional people. We're all multidimensional communities, right? So Greg asked us to talk a little bit about some of the things that have worked and some of the things that have not been as successful. I want to touch for just a second on the public charge NPRM that is likely going to be forthcoming from the Trump administration. It is about, trying to ensure that sort of creating formalizing, right? We don't want certain people in, we want certain people out, and it's saying that we don't want people who will be dependent on systems, who will have to, and we don't know yet what will finally be in it because we haven't seen the final text, but this is to say that if you will not be eligible for a green card, if you or members of your family have accessed food stamps, Medicaid, potentially Head Start, I mean, there's a long list of things that might be in it, we don't know yet. But that's dividing different folks, different communities, but it's also very fundamentally deserving and undeserving, right? And that's a thread that I think goes throughout this, and that it's important to just sort of surface. One of the things that I think it's important within the movement around DACA and DREAM is how diverse that community actually is. Yes, percentage-wise, it is mostly Latino, but there is a huge Asian American component, right? And NACASEC has been a huge player and a vocal participant in that, and not just NACASEC, but that's one of the main groups. And also there's African immigrants, right? And so UndocuBlack, and there's a lot of other organizations, and I think working together and saying this is not just a Latino issue, this is an issue that cuts across all communities is really important and powerful. And you could see that in all of the actions that happened at the beginning of the year around the importance of actually passing DACA when the president decided to end the program. So that fight continues. And finally, I'll say one thing that I think has been successful. The administration put forward a citizenship question for the census. I'm sure you've heard about it. There's been a lot of talk about it, and that's really an attempt to chill responses to the Senate, to the census, and to have an undercount. That's really, it's an attack on democracy, right? Because that's how you decide how districts are apportioned, and it's also how you decide how. Excuse me?
Federal dollars.
Yeah, that's right. That's the second point. Federal dollars, where are they going? And it's if you're not counted, and you should be counted, and you're not going to be getting as many dollars. And that's so important. And so I think we were really able to actually translate, and everyone understood, like, we're all in this together. We need everyone to be counted. We need a fair and accurate count. And so we were able to get hundreds of thousands of comments in on this question, hopefully slowing it down. There are more than 6 lawsuits going around the country challenging this, really talking about how this is an attack on all of us. So that, again, I think is an example of effective coalition building.
When it comes to inclusion, either in coalitions or in our nation's policies, I think many of you are already familiar that there's a model minority myth out there. Mm-hmm. There is a history of our communities being perpetually othered, where on tables and reports and graphs, we're left out of those data, or we're just lumped into an other category, or we're otherwise made invisible or whitewashed. And I think that in order for us to really counteract those contributors to the narrative of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, it's important for us to continue to think about how do we grow the data and stories about our communities. Marie has mentioned disaggregated data. When you look at data for our communities in aggregate, it paints a really different picture from when you take that data and look at per particular racial ethnic subgroups within the ANHPI diaspora. When you think about our communities too, so many of our communities actually have rich traditions of storytelling. How can we leverage and tap into that power of storytelling to help others understand the realities of our community? How do we leverage that power of storytelling to build connection with our fellow community coalitions? And as we tell those stories, how do we weave the intersectionalities? From my own personal journey as a gay Asian immigrant, I never felt completely comfortable as a gay man in the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community. And as an Asian Pacific Islander, I never felt completely comfortable in the LGBT community. And I feel like a lot of my early 20s and 30s was about trying to find my voice, to create visibility for me and for my fellow communities. What I failed to realize, though, was in my advocacy work and my coalition building work, it wasn't enough to create visibility for the people who look like me. But it was when I started to look around and see that intersectionality, when I started to speak up and out for the communities around me that I might not have necessarily identified or looked as like, that's when those community members, that's when those colleagues in turn lifted up and spoke out in support of the issues that I cared about. And so I hope that that's a lesson that all of us have learned within this room, that as we think about the journey that we are in as Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, yes, we have to vocalize the realities that our communities are experiencing. Yes, we have to vocalize how the data and stories of our communities hasn't been fully told. But as we're telling those stories, we have to make sure that we're not playing the game of oppression Olympics. When it comes to success, I do want to riff on the themes you've already heard of in terms of consensus and intersectionality, and to lift up the work that we and many of the organizations on this panel, as well as in this room, have done on the Health Equity and Accountability Act. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Health Equity and Accountability Act, which Congresswoman Chu previously referenced, it's an omnibus bill that looks at what health equity could look like for all of our communities. But health equity not just from the context of race, ethnicity, but looking at how it intersects with immigration status, with disability, with LGBT, with gender expression, with so many different parts of what makes us individuals and makes us collectively American. And in particular, I want to note the work of the Health Forum's Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs, Amina Farati, as well as our Senior Policy Analyst, Ben Davanzo, who for the past year and a half have helped to shepherd and navigate a coalition of 100 different community-based advocacy organizations to come together to help influence the continued development of the Health Equity and Accountability Act. 100 different organizations operating on a principle of consensus. It takes a lot of time, but hopefully through that process of operating through consensus, what we've had the opportunity to do is to develop the trust and relationship with one another so that we all see a part of our communities reflected in the final bill language. So as I think about success, whether it's around the Health Equity and Accountability Act or a continued fight to preserve affirmative action or to advance data disaggregation, I think of success actually in 3 different dimensions. One is the results. So did we actually get that bill passed? Were we able to get something introduced in Congress? I also think of success in the context of process. How inclusive was the process that we used to be in coalition with one another? How clear was that process so that people could see where they intersected and where they fit in and where they could best contribute? But most importantly, is perhaps relationships. What are the relationships that we've developed along the way? What's the trust that we've developed and engendered in one another? And how can we then use that trifecta of relationships, of process, and results to ultimately advance the health and well-being and justice for our collective communities across the U.S.?
Coalition is really courageous, hard work. And how many of you are the leaders of your organization? Right, so you probably get called on the most, right? We want you in the room with these 5 other people for 2 hours while you're running an organization. You probably have a life outside of your organization. You might have a staff, but they only want you. If it's not you, it's not going to work. So I think that's a challenge when you're deciding how to build a coalition, because a coalition is made up of people, and there is this tried and true presumption that if you can get the top in, everything will work out. So for those of you who raised your hands, I'm just assuming that's always true. If they get you, they've got it. For some, it doesn't work that way. And so I would encourage you all in your own organizations to think of which positions, which people with what temperaments would be your best representative at each table. It's not always the CEO. It's not always the ED, especially when you get in and figure out what the rest of the work is like, and especially when you think long game, which is what the opposite side tends to do a little better than us, of who you're developing for the next generation of fighting and coalition building. Because if it's always you and no one else, then it ends with you. And people have to start at square one when we're fighting these fights another 30, 50 years from now. So that's one thing I want to put out, and that's something that being a part of the Racial Equity Anchors has allowed me to do in my role. I don't think I was who Kellogg wanted there, but now I'm there, and so there. Also, I would say, with also thinking about that in our particular situation, you really need to pursue your purpose before you think about following the money. I know it's so tempting to just follow the money and figure out how you can fit in with the little description of what they want you to do and how you're going to change the world in exactly 12 months. I know. But you really need to stick to your principles and really stick to your purpose and really be clear when you go into coalition, because that clarity will make your work so much better for you personally. It will contribute to the process. It will make it easier for those working in alignment and intersecting with you to figure out this is where they are on it, this is where I can push, this is where I can't. And that principled stand is your reputation. And I know, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I'm probably the youngest person up here and, probably grew up with, whatever number of fun spaces that Ed listed earlier. Friendster was amazing. It needs to come back. But I think the hardest thing, which goes back to standing on principle and teaching a next generation of coalition builders how to be in these spaces, is that it is long work, but a lot of it is also work built on trust. And I think there's such a call for transparency right now, which I agree with, but in the public sphere, transparency is because we're lacking trust. So since I don't trust you, show me your whole hand. You know what I mean? So the call for transparency isn't always about accountability, but more this deficiency of trust. I don't trust you to go to that meeting without me present, so I'm going to find a way to be there because we haven't built that trust so that when you're meeting with your caucus, I know you're also lifting these issues. So that if Asian Americans Advancing Justice is sitting down at leadership conference talking about census, we're not at the National Urban League worried. We got other things to do and we know they're handling it. We're moving on because there's some other things we could be working on, like ESSA with UNIDOS. So you really need to work on building that trust. And when you have that trust, knowing that in the long game, everything is not going to be tweetable, shareable, or likable. Some of it's going to happen behind closed doors, and we need to be building leaders who know how to act behind closed doors. This that I'm going to say is common knowledge. You can Google it or ask a friend. I don't know what the lifelines are. But people sat down. Wealthy people, George Soros, political influencers, insiders, sat down with the original leadership of Black Lives Matter and was like, okay, what do you guys want then? Oh, we don't. Okay, we want stuff to stop. And I'm not saying that to fault them. What I'm saying is they come from a legacy of people who know power concedes nothing without a demand, and they went into that meeting without demands. That's all of our faults. That's all of our fault. And we cannot keep raising generations of people who know how to work in coalition intrinsically and don't know how to work power. We have to find a way to do both. And that means that we need to model what power sharing looks like so they know what to demand when they show up in these power hoarding rooms. They need to be able to be very clear. 10 points, write it down. I'm amazed by what's happening with the August 21st prison strike. They're fighting for Pell Grants. They're in prison striking for Pell Grants. Thank you, prisoners. Thank you so much. So it's like you have to really be thinking about the long game beyond the short-term gains, really stand on principle and build that trust and show another person on your staff how to do it. No one's going to tell you, well, some folk might, but most coalitions don't start with closed doors. You can bring someone along intentionally and say, this is one of our values. If you're going to ask for the ED, you're going to get mid-management or junior staff too. This is a value. This is what it looks like to work with us. Especially for those of us who are working at organizations that can afford it, can afford the human capital to be a part of it, and especially those of us who are at organizations 30 or 50 years old, you're going to be in this fight 50 years from now too. And you want to make sure you've built the leadership to handle it with unknown and imminent threats coming our way.
Now, in closing, because we are running out of time, one of the issues that hasn't come up explicitly is affirmative action. I think everyone in this room is aware of what's happening at Harvard University, and as we've heard, the divide and conquer strategy to sort of wedge Asian American Pacific Islanders into that debate, certainly from hearing from all of our panelists, there's lessons to be learned and ways that we can apply their observations and experiences to help be a part of a coalition that stands for affirmative action. And so, in closing, I do want to actually take a moment to thank the staff of the hotel who helped us enjoy lunch as well as run this panel. So let's give them a round of applause. And then finally, I'll say, from listening to our panelists, I hope you found this thought-provoking and interesting. For me, I think it's become clear that for the Asian American Pacific Islander community, this is our next great challenge. how do we continue to find our voice and grow our power, but do it in a way that we can continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies. And certainly folks further down the street and further down that way could take a lesson from this, and understanding that the path to progress really is done in a way where we're working together with everyone, embracing our diversity and not running from it. So thank you all very much, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, everyone, for this very thought-provoking panel and for your attention to it. We really appreciate having Greg be the moderator and all of our distinguished speakers today. So let's give them a round of applause. We do not have a break, so you are being asked to move to the next panel sessions between women claiming their power and veterans in the workforce.